uh, where we left off, maybe. But one of the things that I want us to think about to begin with is because what transpires here in the exploits under the leadership of Joshua and all these cities that are being defeated, just like you would expect to happen in normal warfare, sometimes there are people who raise ethical questions as to the propriety of what's taking place when you kill a bunch of people, and after you of course, you start off with the kings, the 5 kings, you put them in a cave, and then you get them out and you kill them, and you throw them back in the cave after you get done. So you bury them at least. You don't just leave them laying out on the battlefield. But all of the destruction that takes place, and the burning of cities, and the destruction of all the people, young and old, male and female and all, then some have the tendency to look on that and they say, well, that just can't be right. But the distinction that has to be understood is this is not a decision that was determined by Joshua. This was a decision that was determined by God. And God doesn't make any mistakes. Now think about it from the standpoint as well, from what we talked about on Sunday as it relates to what about those poor people in the deepest, darkest jungles of Africa who never had the opportunity to hear the gospel like we have? And how could God be just? And of course, hopefully, we're able to see through that facade that's oftentimes presented in the fact that the Bible promises, God promises in His Word, that there is no such thing as an honest-hearted person, an honest and good-hearted person who desires the truth, who will not be given the opportunity providentially to hear and obey the truth. There just is no such person. And throughout the totality of Bible history, we see that the people who were open and receptive to doing God's things in God's ways was always very puny compared to the vast majority of people who wanted to just keep on doing what they was doing and did not want to have any interference with what they desired to do. So it shouldn't surprise us today either that that same type of disparity exists, in that regardless of how clear the truth is, regardless of how easily understood God's plan of salvation is, people oftentimes fly right in the face of the obvious truth and deny it and reject it and are satisfied with something other than the truth, and thus they do not enjoy purified souls, because purified souls are only the result of obeying the truth. And when you see the terrible calamity that existed in the land of Canaan, and we constantly have to be reminded, obviously, that they did not get into the situation they were in overnight. There was a long progression of ungodliness that continued to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And the terminology that God even used back in the days of Abraham was that your people, your descendants, are going to go into the land of Canaan and take it, but right now the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, which means there's still some redeeming qualities that exist in some of the people that live in Canaan. But the time's going to come, and it did come, in which there were no redeeming qualities that existed in the Canaanites. None. And I'm not the one that made that determination either. It was God that made that determination. And He knows when a people have gone past the point of no return. He knows that. And thus, in reality, when you think about the little ones, the innocent ones who died right along with their sorry, worthless parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and everybody else that was in charge, they were actually saved from a catastrophic existence in which they would have been separated from God when they grew up as well, following the lead of their parents and everybody else that they were running around with. They were, in fact, given an opportunity to die as innocent human beings, having not reached the age of accountability, and thus end up being saved eternally because they never were sinners. They were safe. Okay? So there's a good that came from the result of the extermination of the heathen that lived in the land then. So when an attack is made on a so-called holy, holy, holy God, as to the impropriety, they would say, for him to actually legislate the destruction of a people like this is simply a demonstration that people think they're smarter than God, sadly, and fail to realize that right and wrong and truth and error is not something determined by counting noses. It's determined by what God has said. And he make no mistakes. Yes, Victor.
I mean, what if these people were as bad as Hitler?
Yeah.
You could say, well, these people were as bad as Hitler. These people would agree that, they need to be destroyed. They need to be taken out.
Yeah. And I've even...
Examples. Really
Oh, absolutely. Would the world been better off if some people had been shot in the head a long time before they were able to do what they did? Well, of course, obviously so. And the terrible consequences of the lives of ungodly people ends up affecting a whole lot more than just them. I mean, you've got world wars and the destruction of don't tell how many innocent lives because of God not interfering and allowing free moral agency of individuals to cause one group of people to rise up in opposition to the wholesale slaughter of people in some other country and seek to remedy it from a justice standpoint, at least is what we determine to be justice, which is always going to be far lacking in the justice that God, of course, initiates for sure. To look at the culture, and I would suggest just doing a little bit of history research of the depravity that existed in Canaan at this time and how destructive to the human race this depravity was, and that's one of the reasons why they were given the specific responsibility of exterminating them and not allowing them to influence the Israelites. And of course, they failed miserably in doing what God told them to do, and so they ended up suffering the consequences of it as well. And you would think that some of the things that were so ungodly and so just plain old mean, but yet I was watching last night. They were taking a vote in North Carolina because the state legislature, House and Senate both, they sent a bill to the desk of the governor that did away with any abortion after 12 weeks, except in extreme circumstances. And of course, the governor, doing the bidding of the baby killers, then he vetoed it. Well, then the legislature overrode his veto. And so here's all these people that are fighting mad. What are they so mad about? They want more babies to die. That's it. Now, what kind of culture are we living in which people get upset when they can't kill babies? It don't make any sense. And yet, here we are in the highly intellectual age so far removed from Canaan, and yet the very same things they did that got them wiped off the face of the earth, we promote. And I say we in a collective sense for people who could and should know better, but yet they don't. Yes, sir. It's just, it's mind-boggling. I was listening to this fella who's been killing babies for 40 years, and he specializes in late-term abortions. And he just flat out says, that here was one woman, and she was 8 months pregnant, and found out the baby was a little boy, and she didn't want a little boy. She wanted a little girl. And so he helped her out, if you want to call that helped her out, and got rid of that child And then she can, who knows, the next child may be a boy too. Whoops, kill him too, you know. I mean, it's just, it's ludicrous. It's just sickening. And of course, that's the end result of, I mean, here you got the Canaanites, their explanation for what they were doing was that they did not know the true God of heaven, and so the fake and phony deities they served were just like that, you know. Anything goes. And that's sadly what ends up being the case in our world today, is that people have enthroned themselves as the gods, and whatever they decide is supposedly their truth. And if their truth determines they need to kill their baby instead of raising it, then there's a lot of people that'll let them travel to a state in which they can do that and pay gas for them and everything else, and feel like they're doing them a great service. Sickening, sad, pitiful. You know, it's a terrible situation. So. Yeah.
I heard something last night that was so insane. It set me off.
Yeah.
It was just.
I mean, and the thing is about justice. You know, we know for a fact that ultimately truth and justice will win out. Okay. But. And I think I even said this Sunday, I don't think it's wrong to wish that every now and then justice would be served now instead of having to wait till the Lord comes back. You know? But sadly, it's just not happening as much as we would like for it to happen, for sure. So God is a holy, holy, holy God, and His justice is perfectly tempered with His mercy and grace. But He cannot and will not acquit the wicked. He's not going to do that. And so, and you know, and the thing about the people who would take issue with the God of the Bible, who would instruct His people to do such things as this, sometimes those are the very same people who want to deny there's such a thing as objective right and wrong. You know, so who are they to question anything? If there is no objective standard, if there is no God, everything goes. And so why would it be so wrong in their eyes, since they reject any divine authority? Why would it be wrong for anybody to do anything? You know, if that's what they want to do, and that's what we're told constantly is what we're supposed to allow people to do, is whatever they want to do, and allow them to reach their fullest potential in whatever it is they're trying to reach it in, then they shouldn't have any argument at all with the decisions that God made back in this period of time in history, for sure. Their imagination has not got them to that point yet, but sadly, it won't be that long before they'll figure it out. That's for sure. All right, keep in mind when we have the pictures, which are very small, I know, but it shows all of the conquest of all these cities and exactly what was involved in taking these cities. And defeating these various city-states, and the decisions that were made even by some of those inhabitants of Canaan to join in confederacies against the Israelites. Thought that might help them out, but of course that does not ultimately work out good for them at all. But in light of that, let's look at our questions then. I've got marked that we made it down to, on page number 6, to letter D, conquest of Canaan is summarized. Now, that means if you summarize in the conquest, and that means we're asking these questions based upon the fact that all of the leadership of Joshua with the whole Israelite army is pretty well done. And now, since all of the strongholds have been broken, and the thing is, when you read here concerning the fact that they whipped this town, you know, and run the army out or destroy the army of the city or whatever, then in some instances, it's not like they completely destroy a city and then they leave people there where nobody else can come in. No, they're just breaking the major forces that will make it easier for the individual tribes then to do the mop-up work, which of course they're going to be given that responsibility to do as well. And some of these cities you'll see when you read through the book of Joshua, then you'll see that some of these cities are defeated more than once, you know, which sort of reminds you of different wars that have transpired down through history, in which, you know, in some cities, different armies owned different floors in the same building. You know, can you imagine that? And so that's what happens here as well. Is you have cities that are defeated, but then lo and behold, they have to go in there and defeat them again as well. So they're not exterminated all, obviously, and they have the opportunity to come back home. And of course, you'd have to catch everybody at home to take them all out, and that simply doesn't happen. So at the top of the page, Joe, we talked about the waters of Merom, and of course, that's where a great successful battle took place. And then, of course, at the city of Hazor, it was destroyed. The people were destroyed, and the city was burned, of course. And then, beginning in the middle of that 11th chapter, the first question says, how many cities made peace with the Israelites? There's only one. Only one did. And of course, that was who? That was the Gibeonites, you know. That was, they're referred to as the Hivites here, but then they're identified as well as being those that live in Gibeon. So that's the ones who made the contract in their deceptive acting job that convinced Joshua and the chief men of the Israelites that these guys were from a long way off. And I mean, it's pretty humorous when you just think about it, because they say, yeah, we made us some fresh food when we left, and now look at it. It's all moldy, so we've been traveling for months, and look how much dust is all over our shoes. And I mean, we've been traveling for eons of time, when that's just not so. And of course, when they were found out, then who do you think is going to jump on them and try to take them out but their own fellow heathens in the land? And so they say, help, Joshua, remember, you made a contract with us, and said, here we go. So they are saved, but that's the only city that makes peace. And some of the terminology that's used here is exactly the same type of idea that's used to describe the hard-headedness of Pharaoh back when Moses was trying to lead the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. You read that their hearts were hardened, you know. And of course, does that mean that God interfered with anyone's free moral agency and caused them to have a hard heart? Or is it simply descriptive of the fact that sometimes when people ain't about to do the right thing, it don't matter what you say, they're not going to do the right thing? Well, of course, it's the latter, obviously. And if they had simply laid down their arms and moved somewhere else, then their lives could have been spared for sure. All right, number 2, describe the area that's occupied by Israel in the 12th chapter. Probably the easiest way to say it is they're everywhere, but they're not all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, because there's still them stinking Philistines over there and their cities. And there's some Phoenicians as well that are a little bit north there, so they don't have all that territory wiped out. But the thing is, the Philistines are a people to themselves. They're not Canaanites, obviously. They're not descendants of Canaan, as were the rest of them. But obviously they are a people who are not good, and they are in opposition to what God's trying to accomplish. And for sure, they're not going to be wiped out, because if they were, there would not have been any Delilah for Samson to fall in love with and end up getting a haircut. So those people are still there. So I would say all except the Philistine territory is now occupied. Does that mean that every city is subdued and every non-Israelite is doing the right thing? No, that's not what it means at all. But it does mean that the back of the opposing armies have been thoroughly defeated, to the extent that they don't have to worry about a giant rebellion to push them back across the Jordan River. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It don't mean everything's going to be easy for the individual tribes now, but if they do what God has told them to do, then they can be successful in that. Now, that's the difference is they're not going to be faithful to what God commissions them to do, and so they're going to fail miserably, which is always the way it works. All right, in chapter 13, let's read the first 7 verses here, if you don't mind. Joshua was old and stricken in years. That language, stricken in years, I used to think that was funny. I don't anymore. That is an apt description of sometimes a person's position, physically speaking. They feel like they've been struck to the point that they're in pieces. And how in the world they're able to stand up, we don't know. That the Lord said unto him, Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed. Okay? This is the land that yet remaineth, all the borders of the Philistines, and all Geshurah, from Sihar, which is before Egypt, even unto the borders of Ekron northward, which is counted to the Canaanite, 5 lords of the Philistines, and Gazarites, and Ashdodites, and Ashkelonites, the Gittites, and the Ekronites, also the Avites. From the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and Meirah, that is beside Sidonians, and to Aphek, to the border of Amorites. So there's still a lot of territory left as he continues on. All right? But notice, as he continues spelling all that out, he says in verse 6, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon into Mispathaim, and all the Sidonians, them will I drive out from before the children of Israel. Only divide thou it by lot unto the Israelites for an inheritance, as I have commanded thee. All right, now that's going to be an answer to the next question here. And so he restates verse 7, now therefore divide this land for inheritance to the 9 tribes and half tribe Manasseh. Wait a minute, 9 1/2 tribes? Where's the other tribe? They're on the east side. So you got 2 1/2 and 9 1/2. And so here the land is being divided. And number 2, the question is, what command was given concerning the land? It's going to be what? Divided by lot. What does that mean? I thought Lot was a nephew of Abraham. He lived way back. Is Lot going to be resurrected so he can do? What is it talking about? Yeah. They had some kind of you know, like I have before draw straws, you know. Whoever gets the shortest straw, you get stuck with somebody or something, you know. So all is involved in it. Then while we would think when it comes to drawing straws, and there is no divine decree as to do it, then it's a matter of luck, bad or good, as to what you're going to end up with. But when it's being done in carrying out divine will, then God is in control of the decision, and it's made known through the casting of lots. And of course, I know there's people that ask, well, why not just say it? You know, why not just tell what's going to be done? But again, you know, I'm not the one that wrote the Bible, but God had a reason for that. And so we see all types of specific circumstances in the Old and New Testament as well, in which God lets his will be known by the casting of lots.
I think it would be more accepting of the outcome, you know, if they had some party casting lots, you know, and this.
Yes.
Rather than assigning it to them and they say, oh, you know,
Yeah.
we don't like this.
Yeah.
It's too steep a hill or too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They say, well, that's not right. So, what God have against us, giving us this property over here where we're going to have short-legged cattle on one side because the hills are so tall. So they're dividing it by lot in verse 6, and that's, of course, what they end up doing. Next page, number 7, the settlement in Canaan. And here, of course, it's talking about the east side of the Jordan River, geographical boundaries. Of course, we just mentioned it a minute ago, but who received the land east of the Jordan River? All right, so we got Gad and Reuben and a half tribe of Manasseh. And, of course, there's many lessons that are significant from just the fact that they desired to stay on that side of the Jordan River, and they were granted that desire by Moses in accordance with divine will. And of course they couldn't just say, all right, we're not going to fool with y'all, we're going to stay right over here, because they had to provide soldiers from their tribes to help with what's taking place now with the destruction of the Canaanite forces under the leadership of Joshua. Number
Not to back us up, per se, if you got a number on that amount that much is left to be conquered, I read somewhere when we first started this, that the original amount was like 300,000 square miles, and they had conquered like 30,000, like 10% of it.
Wow.
You got a number on that?
No.
I tried to find it last night, I couldn't remember, I don't know where I read that, but I do remember reading that in one commentary, that was the,
About so
they got 10% of it.
is that all the land that had been conquered by the whole army?
It's what I read in
Yeah.
the commentary, but I was curious if you knew anything better than that.
No.
Seems small, that seems very
Oh yeah, for sure.
small to me.
And of course, the thing is, it's repeatedly it's mentioned that it was not the responsibility given to the whole army under the leadership of Joshua to eradicate all of the Canaanites. That's going to come down to the individual tribes. And of course, you can look at it from a practical standpoint, because if I am in battle and I'm fighting to run somebody out of some piece of property that I don't have anything to do with, then my motivation may not be as keen as if when I know where my property is, and I know that as long as these people that need to be leaving are stuck in my property, that I'm not going to be successful in being able to accomplish what God wants me to do. And so I've got more of a personal stake in it to be more active in removing them. But sadly, it seems to be the case that the very opposite happened. I mean, once they were all together under the leadership of Joshua, they were a whole lot more successful in doing what they're supposed to be doing than the individual tribes were. And of course, there's many different excuses as to why that's the case. And we know for a fact that if there's a decision to be made between what's the right thing to do and what's the easy thing to do, sadly, many times, if not most, we go ahead and do the easy thing rather than the right thing. And that's exactly what the tribes did, as we'll see real quick right here in just a few minutes.
Ready?
Yes, sir.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the whole land ultimately that was promised and fulfilled was 60,000 square miles.
60,000 square miles. Yeah.
Correctly, from the river of Egypt to the river.
Euphrates, yeah. And of course, that sounds like a whole lot, but in comparison to the rest of the territory around the Palestine area, it's small. I mean, it's still a big piece of property, obviously. Go ahead. That is a big city for sure. That's definitely a big city. And concerning the amount of work that was done and still the amount that had to be done, you know, even as it relates to how long the campaign took place. I mean, we've read it here in a few verses, but the smallest amount of time that it could have been would have been 7 years, and it could have been on up to 10 or 14 even years that this has taken place.
That 60,000 figure, I think, was the figure ultimately of Solomon's reign.
Yes.
That was when it was ultimately fulfilled to be 60,000.
60,000 square miles.
Then, but David, in 2 Samuel 7:3 or 8:3, he defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zola, and as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates.
Yeah.
You know, there was some back and forth, I guess.
Yeah.
In terms of some conquering and reconquering. But ultimately, under Solomon, I believe the figure was 60,000.
60,000. And of course, by the time that we get to the end of the book of Joshua, the statement's made, nothing failed that God had promised Israel all came to pass. So, and of course, the reason why we point that out is because people today are still saying, well, you know, the Jews have a permanent land promise over in the Middle East, you know, so we got to be friends to Israel, and which is, of course, wrong, obviously. The children of Israel were God's chosen people, but they're not anymore. Does God have chosen people today? Yeah, Jews and Gentiles that have obeyed the gospel and are Christians. That's who God's chosen people are.
They contend that the land promise hasn't been fulfilled.
That's it.
The Bible clearly says it has.
Yeah. And it's sad that people will get sidetracked on something like that and fail to see the clarity for sure. Number two, what groups of people were not driven out of the land? And I've got marked verse 13 identifies them for sure. When it says expelled not, that's just a nice way of saying they didn't run them out. They did not expel this group of people. And then sadly, notice at the end of that verse, it says, and these people dwell among Israelites until this day. Okay? So, and that's going to be a common theme for sure, because the allowing the heathen to stay put and not to be exterminated, not converted, not run out of town, then you're going to end up being adversely affected by them and their sorry example. And that's going to be their downfall. Now, it'll take some years until it gets to the point where God says, all right, northern kingdom, go into Syrian captivity, southern kingdom, go into Babylonian captivity, but that's will be the end result of their failure to do what they were supposed to do right here. And they're going to suffer the consequences for that. In other words, they're their own worst enemy when it comes to suffering those types of consequences. All right, beginning there in the middle of chapter 13, some tribal boundary questions. What tribe received no inheritance in the land? The Levites. Now, what does the text say here relative to why they should not be crying because they are not without being the recipients of something. Although it's not land, what does it say they receive? They receive burnt offerings as if their inheritance. What was that talking about? They receive burnt offerings? Man, who wants a burnt offering instead of land? Let me tell you something. You got all the land in the world and you ain't got nothing to eat, you're going to die. You're not going to be able to survive. And so, obviously, they were taken care of by part of the sacrifices that they were offering for the people in behalf of their worship to God. And that's the way they were paid. And the specific parts that they were allowed to eat and that which was used as sacrifice unto God was spelled out in detail. And then notice verse 33 as well. But unto the tribe of Levi Moses gave not any inheritance. The Lord God of Israel was their inheritance. So, wait a minute. How is that the case? You know, how could God be their inheritance? They were in a special position, weren't they? As the priestly tribe, they had, of course, greater opportunity because of that favored position, but along with that opportunity came greater responsibility too. You know, while they were communicators of God's will to the common man, and then involved in all the worship activities first in the tabernacle and then in the temple, then they had this special relationship. And that separate priesthood, of course, no longer exists because every child of God today is a what? Is a priest. Every child of God is a priest. And Jesus Christ is our high priest. We don't have to whisper in some special priest ear. We have access to the throne of God through our high priest, Jesus Christ. And the next questions here have to do with all the different cities, and we could have a test and see how many people could write all those cities down and spell them correctly. But that would be, it might be beneficial, but I don't know how. What cities were given to the tribes of Reuben? Well, they're listed there in verse 16 through 21. And then we're brought to another man to our attention who's been out of the picture for a little while. And question number 3, and his name is Balaam. What do we know about this fellow? He was a guy who would preach anything if the money was right. He can preach it. He can preach a squared circle or a four-legged or a four-sided triangle if you pay him enough money. He can do it. He loved the reward for his speaking. And, of course, he was the problem as children of Israel were in the wilderness wandering, and here he ends up being alive here. What happens to him? He ends up dying. And he dies as an enemy of God's people, for sure. Then number 4, the cities that were given to the tribe of Gad starts in verse 25 through 27. And the cities that were given to Manasseh, the half tribe of Manasseh, starts in verse 29 and continues through 32. And then let's get to chapter 14 real quick. That's about out of time. In chapter 14, let's read verses 1 through 5. These are the countries which the children of Israel inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar, who happens to be mentioned here alongside Joshua, and he's mentioned because he's a what? He's a priest, so he's a high priest in actuality. Okay, he's a descendant of Aaron, and he's a high priest. And here's Joshua, who's the chief commanding officer. And then you've got the heads of the families of the children of Israel. And here they are actively involved in this dividing of the land for each individual tribe. And so you read there in verse number 2 that it wasn't a matter of a person's personal preference or anything like that. No, the land was being divided by lot as God commanded. And of course, again, here it mentions for the 9.5 tribes, because the other 2.5 tribes are still on the other side of the river. Now, explain this to me. We end up with 12 tribes, but with 12 tribes that receive territory, but we know that Levites don't receive any territory. How do you explain that? All right. Joseph had 2 sons. All right. And of course, that's where the difference and the distinction comes. Those sons, of course, we mentioned the half tribe of Manasseh, Manasseh and Ephraim were those 2 tribes. And later on, it's interesting that sometimes, especially in the prophets, you'll have the whole nation referred to sometimes as Ephraim. And I don't think that was because God viewed them as being such a great representative of his people. It was that they thought they were. They thought because they were the descendants of Joseph, then they were better than everybody else. See, the same type of stuff that we have to deal with today has been in existence for a long, long time. Yeah. And so you got the children of Joseph. There's 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and actually Manasseh is one of the largest tribes, especially with half of it being on one side and half on the other of the Jordan River. And notice in verse 4 too, it says that the Levites didn't have any land, but it says save, which is not a word that we use. Here it means except they did have what? They had cities. And there's even a term here that you wouldn't actually, I don't think, expect to see it, but it says not only they have cities, but they had the suburbs of the cities. You say, suburbs? We got suburban squall, let's go in here, even back in the days of Joshua, of all things. And, of course, there you go. That's where you have to get outside the city where you can have a garden halfway. It probably did. And of course, we'll end up seeing in the next chapter or two the cities of refuge, which all, of course, were Levitical cities too, which is an interesting situation as it relates to proper punishment for someone who's lost their life and the responsibility of the next of kin in that regard. But that's a whole different matter that we'll have to spend a little bit of time talking about for sure. It's right now, it's fixing to run out of time, so let's stop right there. And we'll begin, Lord willing, here on page number 8, Sunday morning. Boy, that just seems like we didn't.